Dive into the past's murky reputation, and you'll find a shocking first revelation. The Middle Ages, a time often painted as relentlessly filthy, was anything but. Imagine stepping into a dimly lit alley in Bruges 1250. The air is heavy, with candle smoke. But there's something else. A delicate scent of lavender and rose rolling off walking nobles. Pause. This scent isn't accidental. It's the outcome of carefully crafted bathing rituals, of scented waters replenished daily, and of a deeply rooted appreciation for If our modern misconception of dirty medieval folk were true, we wouldn't be sniffing rosewater and jasmine wafting through cobblestone courtyards. We wouldn't find perfectly preserved soap bars in the ruins of York, halls of ancient bathhouses in Warsaw, or laundry guides in church manuscripts. We wouldn't find poetry that praises smooth skin, or manuscripts depicting families gathered around wooden tubs, daughters washing their hair, children like any we, no giggling under splashes of cool water. So why do we hold on to this dirty myth? The answer doesn't lie with medieval airs, lies with the Victorians, a period of swaggering confidence in human progress. The Victorian era looked back at the Middle Ages with contempt. They coined it the Dark Ages to glorify their own industrial triumphs. They painted medievalers as dirty, superstitious, backward, and century after century, that lie stuck like grime on a cellar wall. That's the lie we were sold, that soap, water, and scrubbing were alien to a time cloaked in chainmail and plague masks. But if you delve deeper, into illuminated manuscripts and private letters, into archaeological digs and aromatic manuscripts tucked in abbey basements, a deeper, more surprising reality emerges. These people didn't just wash, they celebrated cleanliness. They scented themselves, scrubbed clothes in rivers, and distilled oils for baths. They used soap-hard bars made from ash and animal fat. They built bathhouses with changing rooms and heated water. They understood that cleanliness wasn't vanity, was dignity, it was safety, it was ritual, and it was beauty. Consider Lady Maerwynn of Bruges. Her chamber stored bundles of lavender and rose petals, vials of rosewater, and wooden tubs. Each Thursday, she layered linen in those tubs, invited her closest friends, heard their laughter over rising steam, breathed in the scent of chamomile and mint. Then, after bathing, they anointed each other with rose-scented oil, a small moment of pampering, of sisterhood and self-respect. Their skin glowed, their spirits lifted. This wasn't an oddity, it was tradition. Across Christendom, nobles soaked, scrubbed, massaged, and purified not because they had to, but because they believed in the ritual of renewal. Down the streets, in Paris, florists and soapmakers worked with perfumers and oils. They crafted gifts to please the senses and calm the soul. Public bathhouses weren't just dirty dens, they were meeting places. Business was conducted over warm water, gossip was shared, young lovers held hands in adjoining tubs. These were social centers, not cesspools. In cities like Bogota or Constantinople, bathhouses had separate chambers, hot and cold rooms, pools, benches. They even had attendants who handed out spiced tea or scented towels. And let's not forget the simplest proof, archaeology. In the ruins of York's bathhouse, clay-lined tubs are intact. In Krakow, charred fragments of soap made of tallow and lye still smell faintly if you hold them to your nose. In a peasant's cottage in Bavaria, oak combs emerged next to small wooden boxes, containers for oils and salves. The fact that they bothered to store them tells you everything. They cared. They took pride in their appearance, in their bodies, and they did so, not just for themselves, but for their community. Even the so-called dirty lower classes joined the movement. Bathhouses weren't exclusively for the wealthy. In Cordoba, working families paid nominal fees to soak on market days. Tailors, bakers, and blacksmiths washed daily. Children swam in water that flushed away the day's dust, and they came out glowing, laughing, their laughter echoing off tiled walls. Historians unearthed records showing that a family of craftsmen might rent a suite of tubs for a week to honor a festival or celebrate the return of a loved one. That's not mud. That's mindfulness. Does this mean they had hot showers like ours? No, but they didn't require them to understand that cleanliness mattered. They bathed in wooden tubs, often near hearths or in steam rooms heated by simple masonry. They used herbs to scent water and disguise impurities. They swept streets, cleared refuse, and ran rivers through cities. They washed their clothes and scrubbed them clean. They saw water as restorative, not wasteful, especially during plague years, when they noticed that it helped curb infections. Hence, Venice, Genoa, and Lubeck passed ordinances compulsorily cleaning public baths and streets. What our ancestors knew is what we forget. Cleanliness is hope. It is respect for yourself and those around you. It's a signal that you matter. When Lady Maerwynn and her friends stepped into scented tubs, they weren't just washing, they were telling the world they were worthy. When peasants scrubbed their tunics on river stones, they were affirming their pride and place. When soapmakers like Friar Edric in Canterbury crafted aromatic soap to protect monks in infirmaries, they were wielding hygiene as kindness and shield. Cleanliness in the medieval mind was an expression of community, faith, and identity, spiritual balm against chaos. Now, pause with me and breathe in that contrast. That haunting image we grew up with, of dirt everywhere, is shattered. It makes you question how else history has lied, and what other truths remain hidden beneath layers of prejudice and misunderstanding. Stay with me, I promise you. In the next parts, you'll meet laundresses who dreamed of safe, healing spaces, woodcarvers who gave birth to toothbrushes, noblewomen who built bathhouses for the poor during plague, children splashing in communal pools, their joy echoing through centuries. You'll feel the dignity they felt, the resilience in cold water, the warmth of shared steam, and ultimately, you'll see how our history is woven with threads of cleanliness, ritual, and human connection. And you won't see the Middle Ages the same way again. If you're already feeling intrigued, amazed, or a little scandalized by what you've just heard, hit that subscribe button. Your support fuels these stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about the past. Let's journey deeper and uncover history's hidden whispers together. In the heart of medieval Europe, where cathedrals soared into the skies and cobbled streets echoed with the rhythm of life, a quieter ritual pulsed beneath the surface. Bathing. It wasn't a luxury reserved for the powerful or a forgotten relic of Roman grandeur. It was a daily, weekly, and seasonal rhythm that bound people together in shared warmth and intention. Communal and private bathing traditions weren't simply about washing dirt away. They were about belonging, restoration, and the preservation of both body and soul. Across the continent, bathhouses rose beside market squares, abbeys, and riverbanks, places where people of all walks of life came to not just cleanse, but commune. In cities like Paris, Florence, and Cordoba, the bathhouse was as central to life as the town hall or church. It wasn't unusual to find stalls nearby selling fresh towels, soap, dried herbs, or even pastries for after-bath refreshments. The bathhouse was a multi-sensory world where steam curled in the air, voices bounced from stone walls, and the scent of rosemary, bay leaf, and juniper clung to the skin. In Florence, Edric, once anonymous soapmaker's apprentice, crafted a name for himself within the walls of such a bathhouse. He began in the shadows, hauling firewood and scrubbing tiles, but his obsession with improving lather transformed him. He experimented with different fats, goat, boar, even olive oil, and mixed in crushed laurel and river clay to purify the skin without stripping it. Over time, his soap became a hallmark of the Arno district. It wasn't just soap, it was a symbol of dignity, a balm of hope in a world filled with hardship. For the working class, the public bathhouse was a cherished space. It offered a pause from toil, a space to lay down burdens, both physical and emotional. For the merchant, it was a hub of conversation. Deals were whispered between steam clouds. Confidences exchanged between hot and cold plunges. For the young, it was a place of flirtation and innocence. Stolen glances over the edge of a tub, the thrill of proximity beneath the veil of steam. And for the elderly, it was comfort, warmth, and a soothing of ancient joints. The bath design varied, but many followed a similar pattern. A dressing room with lockers, a warm room to acclimate the body, a hot steam room where heat enveloped you like a blanket, a central pool for immersion, and finally, a cool rinse. Attendants moved through the rooms with towels, scented cloths, and sometimes trays of warm, honey drinks, or spiced teas. Massage was often offered, not as indulgence, but as healthful treatment, kneading sore backs, applying herbal oils to inflamed joints. Some cities had elaborate bathhouse networks. In Cordoba, under Islamic influence, bathhouses took on architectural elegance. Domed ceilings, with small star-shaped windows, let in shafts of light. Water flowed through intricate channels. The baths were not only a marvel of engineering, but a reflection of a culture that honored purity as a spiritual principle. Cleanliness wasn't a chore, it was an act of reverence. In contrast, private bathing was more modest but no less meaningful. In wealthier households, wooden tubs were placed near hearths, often on thick rugs with towels warmed beside the fire. The tubs were sometimes lined with linen for comfort, and servants carried heated water from the kitchen in shifts. Herbs such as chamomile, calendula, or mint were steeped into the water to calm the skin and spirit. Family members often bathed together, not as a sign of indecency, but of intimacy and trust. Lady Maerwynn of Bruges, introduced before, took great care in curating her bath nights. Her tub was ringed with candles, and her maidens brewed sachets of lavender and rose petals, letting them float like soft prayers on the surface. Maerwynn believed that bathing was as much for the soul as for the body. She would emerge from the water wrapped in linen, perfumed, restored and ready to receive guests, attend meetings, or simply sit with her thoughts by the fire. Even the poor found ways to recreate this sacred tradition. In cramped city quarters, families often shared sponge baths, wiping one another down with cloths soaked in herbal infusions. In rural areas, streams and hot springs became natural bathhouses. On feast days and holy occasions, villagers might even construct temporary bathing stations near chapels. These simple, makeshift traditions echoed the grandeur of public baths because the intention was the same: to honor the body, to refresh the mind, to connect with others. And bathing was not always about solitude. Seasonal festivals often featured communal washing rituals. In the Germanic regions, midsummer brought with it cleansing ceremonies where entire communities gathered by rivers. People laughed, sang, and soaked, believing that the water not only cleansed the body, but washed away bad spirits and old grief. The water held memory, and stepping into it was a kind of rebirth. There were also rules and rituals. Some bathhouses had strict codes of conduct. Silence was encouraged in certain chambers. In others, songs were sung, hymns, ballads, or local gossip put to rhythm. Men and women bathed separately in most Christian communities, though this varied by region. Attendants, usually older women or eunuchs, ensured safety and modesty, and always there was an emphasis on kindness. In the warmth of shared water, class and status dissolved. A knight and a tailor could share a bath and leave feeling equally renewed. Even the sick and infirm were considered. Some bathhouses doubled as infirmaries. Infirm patrons were gently bathed in healing waters, anointed with salves, and wrapped in blankets. The elderly came not just to cleanse, but to ease pain, to feel heat where age had brought cold. Baths were, in many ways, early wellness centers, offering comfort, community, and care. What's most striking, though, is the emotional landscape of these spaces. Imagine a woman like Isolde of Lyon, a laundress by trade, finally soaking her aching limbs after scrubbing garments by the rain all week. Her bath isn't just relief, it's validation. It's a moment where her labor is honored, her pain acknowledged. Or a young couple, newly married, sharing a private tub for the first time, exchanging shy glances while perfumed steam dances between them. Or an old man, once a soldier, who closes his eyes in the steam and forgets his wounds for a few precious moments. These moments were not recorded in royal charters or epic poems, but they lived in the everyday rhythm of medieval life. They were written in the memory of warm hands, clean skin, and quiet kindness. So no, the Middle Ages were not a time of unrelenting grime and disregard. Bathing, both public and private, was a vital thread in the social fabric. It connected people to each other, to their faith, to their bodies, and to something larger than themselves. It offered dignity in an often harsh world, and it showed that, even then, people understood the power of water, not just to clean, but to heal, to unite, and to transform. Stay with me, because in the next part, we'll journey deeper into the world of scents and sacred rituals, the rich, aromatic world of medieval soap, and the hands that made it. We'll meet Friar Edric in Canterbury, whose oils were so potent they became legends. Don't miss it. It is easy to dismiss medieval soap as crude, unscented lumps meant merely to scrape grime from skin. But that view, like many others about the Middle Ages, is shaped more by modern assumptions than historical truths. In reality, soap-making in medieval Europe was a sensory craft, a healing art, and at times, a spiritual calling. It served not only as a functional tool for cleanliness, but also as a symbol of devotion, health, and status. And nowhere was this more clear than in the work of people like Friar Edric of Canterbury, whose soaps became as revered as sermons. Edric, a quiet monk with an affinity for herbs, worked in the infirmary garden of his abbey, among the lavender. In time, he discovered combinations that didn't just soothe wounds, they elevated the spirit. In the chilly stone chambers of his monastery, he began mixing ash from burned olive branches with rendered fat from sheep raised nearby. He infused this basic mixture with rosemary and thyme oils, crushed marjoram leaves, and a touch of honey. What emerged wasn't merely soap, it was a balm, a sacrament in suds. His soap became sought after not only by pilgrims who passed through Canterbury, but also by nobles from as far as London and Rouen. Its scent lingered in cloth and memory, subtle but distinct, like a blessing left on the skin. But Edric was not alone. Across Europe, soap-making was a domestic tradition passed through generations. In Marseille, the salty air carried the aroma of olive oil and lye. In Toledo, workshops by the river turned animal fats and caustic soda into creamy bars shaped by wooden molds. These soaps weren't mass-produced, they were hand-mixed, stirred over open fires, and left to cure in warm, sunlit corners. Their makers measured time, not in hours, but in changes of scent and texture. And the scents were not random, they were chosen with intention. Rosemary to cleanse, lavender to calm, sage to protect against infection. Scent, in the medieval mind, wasn't superficial. It was believed to influence both mood and morality. Foul odors were thought to invite sin or illness, while pleasant aromas uplifted the soul and warded off disease. To wash with fragrant soap was more than indulgence, it was spiritual hygiene. It was aligning the body with the divine, honoring creation with every lather and rinse. The use of scent extended beyond soap. Women distilled oils from wildflowers and herbs, soaking them in oil or steeping them in wine. These infusions were used not only for bathing, but also for anointing the hair, freshening linens, and perfuming clothing. Perfumed gloves and hair ribbons were treasured gifts. Noblemen would wear sachets of dried herbs in their tunics. Women tied scented bundles to their girdles. Even churches participated in this olfactory culture. Incense filled cathedrals, not just to please the senses, but to purify the space and extension of the belief that scent could sanctify. The act of bathing with soap was often accompanied by ritual. On the eve of marriage, a bride might be bathed by her female relatives in scented water, symbolically shedding her past to embrace a new life. Warriors cleansed themselves before battle, not only to remove physical grime, but to purify their intent. Monks bathed before entering sacred fests, using soap not just to cleanse their bodies, but to prepare their spirits. The soap itself, passed from hand to hand, took on the reverence of a relic. For those who could not afford expensive ingredients, alternatives still existed. Soapwort, a flowering plant, was used as a natural cleanser. Ash mixed with water created lye, a harsh but effective cleanser. Animal fats were rendered in kitchens and flavored with whatever herbs grew nearby. Even among the poorest households, soap wore something like it was made, cherished, and shared, and sometimes it was gifted. In Florence, Edric, now a successful soap artisan, packaged his soaps in linen and sealed them with wax stamped with his family's symbol, a laurel leaf. He didn't just sell these at market. He gave them freely to the elderly, to mothers after childbirth, to widows during mourning. For him, soap was not a product. It was a gesture of grace, of recognition, of healing. Soap-making, too, was often a community act. Families gathered to stir huge vats over shared fires. Children picked herbs in meadows, their laughter mingling with the hiss of boiling mixtures. Stories were told as bars were cut and stacked to cure. Each bar held not just oils and lye, but memory, care, and hope. These were soaps that reminded people they were loved, even in the hardest of times. Even illness was met with the power of soap and scent. During outbreaks of plague, some cities turned to perfumed soaps as protection. Though the science was not yet understood, people sensed that cleanliness mattered. In Venice, soapmakers received special commissions to create bars infused with camphor and myrrh, meant to cleanse not only the hands, but the very air around the sick. It was believed that scent could form a barrier against the invisible. In these moments, soap wasn't a luxury, it was armor. The emotional power of these rituals cannot be overstated. Imagine a grieving mother washing her child's linen with rosemary soap because it reminded her of spring and the boys' laughter. Or a weary traveler handed a bar of lavender soap at an abbey's gate, feeling for the first time in weeks that he was human again. Or a bride taking in the scent of rose and chamomile, her heartbeat steadying as she steps into new life. These are not just moments of cleanliness, they are transformations. The Middle Ages, so often misrepresented as senselessly grim, were in truth deeply attuned to the subtle language of the senses. Touch, smell, texture, and temperature were tools for connection and care. Soap was a message passed from hand to hand. You matter. You are worth the effort of herbs gathered, oils pressed, fire stoked. You are worth being clean, being comforted, being remembered. And so, we must begin to see soap not merely as an invention, but as an inheritance. A bar of soap from medieval Europe was a time capsule. Within it were stories of gardens and gatherings, of friars and forests, of healing and hope. The rituals that surrounded it, bathing before vows, cleansing before worship, anointing before burial, were ways people expressed reverence for life and for one another. In the next chapter, we'll travel deeper into personal care traditions. Hair was not just an accessory, and fabric not just for warmth. Together, they formed a language of identity, ritual, and respect. You'll meet Isolde of Lyon, whose dream of a women's bathhouse became a haven of healing. You'll learn how people of every class turned their bodies into living altars of memory, resilience, and self-worth. Don't miss it. Beyond the warmth of shared bathhouses and the soothing rituals of soap and scent, medieval life held another layer of intimate care, one expressed through the tending of hair, the softening of skin, and the washing of the clothes people wore. close to their bodies. In a world where illness could arrive with the wind and survival often meant enduring brutal seasons, these quiet acts of grooming were never trivial. They were daily affirmations of identity, dignity, and love. Hair in the Middle Ages was more than a crown, it was a living symbol of status, spirituality, and self. To let it go unkempt was often seen as a sign of grief or disgrace. People washed their hair less frequently than their bodies, but they cared for it with reverence. In the homes of nobles and in the cottages of laborers alike, hair care was a practiced art. Rosemary, mint, and chamomile infusions were used as rinses to cleanse the scalp and bring shine. Oils made from nuts, seeds, or animal fat were warmed and applied to soften hair and soothe dry skin. Combs carved from wood or bone were prized personal items, often kept tucked in belts or hanging from cords. In Lyon, where the stone streets echoed with church bells and the scent of river wind, Isolde, the laundress, was known not just for the brilliance of her laundry, but for the sheen of her hair. Every morning before dawn, she would soak a linen cloth in rosewater, comb her long dark braids, and whisper quiet prayers as she rubbed oil into her scalp. It was a ritual her mother had taught her, one she would one day pass to others. Her touch was gentle, practiced, and filled with unspoken intention. To care for her hair was to hold on to something that was wholly hers. Even when the world demanded so much of her body, Isolde's dream of bathhouse for women grew from that quiet discipline. She envisioned a space where women could not only wash but be seen, heard, and restored. She imagined a room lined with braiding benches, soft cloths for drying hair, jars of homemade creams crafted from honey, beeswax, and petals. She imagined the laughter of friends applying rose salve to wind-chapped cheeks, the comfort of hands braiding loose strands back into order, the dignity of emerging clean, brushed, and warm. It took years, but with the help of local patrons who valued her work, that dream came alive. The bathhouse became more than a place of washing, it became a sanctuary for spirit and sisterhood. Skin was another canvas of care. Without commercial lotions, people turned to what nature offered: beeswax, mixed with oil and herbs made for rich, protective balms. Calendula was used to soothe irritation, elderflower to brighten the complexion, honey to heal. Women in court might wear masks made from clay and rosewater. Farmers might soothe their hands with tallow softened over the hearth. Knights carried salves to treat chafing beneath armor. There was no vanity in this. It was survival, comfort, and ritual woven together. Children were taught from a young age to protect their skin from sun and wind. Mothers applied warm salves to chapped knuckles, kissed cheeks reddened by snow. Skincare was not separate from family care. It was braided into lullabies and bedtime prayers. The act of rubbing cream into a child's skin was a gesture that said, "You are safe, you are cherished." And then there was fabric, the second skin. In a time when clothing was worn long and hard, washing wasn't just for appearance. It was necessary for comfort, hygiene, and pride. Laundering was labor-intensive. It began with soaking garments in ash water or fermented lye, followed by scrubbing against stones or wooden boards. Rivers were washing places, but also gathering places. Along the banks of the Rhine, women worked side by side, dipping linens, pounding cloth, telling stories over the sound of flowing water. They knew the properties of each fabric. Wool required special care. Linen could be sun-bleached. Silk was handled with reverence. They exchanged secrets about stains and starching, shared herbs, 2-cent cloth drawers, traded praise and prayer in equal measure. Isolde's fame came not just from her speed or strength, but from her compassion. She knew which families were grieving, and added lavender to the clothes of widows. She stitched loose hems when she could, returned children's garments with extra buttons sewn in. She treated clothing not as rags, but as extensions of their wearers, deserving of care, of attention, of repair. Her fingers bore calluses, but her spirit was light. She believed that no one, no matter how poor or burdened, should walk through the world in garments that smelled of mold or bore stains of despair, and when her bathhouse opened its doors, she made sure to add a laundry room not just for function, but for healing. Women brought in their wash and left with more than clean fabric. They left with laughter, advice, hugs, and the kind of comfort that cannot be bought. The place smelled of soap, steam, and something older solidarity. Perhaps hair, skin, and fabric were deeply personal elements of life, but they were never separate from community. A woman combing another's hair before a feast, a mother smoothing wrinkles from a child's tunic, a friend applying balm to cracked lips in winter. These were acts of love. In a world where life could be uncertain, these rituals grounded people in care and connection. The emotional gravity of such routines cannot be overstated. When people had so little, these daily acts became sacred. A braid tied neatly, a face washed with fresh water, a tunic that smelled of mint. These weren't just signs of hygiene. They were expressions of presence, a defiant assertion of being alive, of being worthy. They reminded people that they were more than laborers, more than peasants or pilgrims. They were human, capable of softness, of beauty, of renewal. We often imagine medieval life as unrelentingly rough, but in truth, it was filled with quiet grace. It pulsed in the rhythm of brushing hair by firelight, of pressing warm cloth to a child's forehead, of soaking clothes in a stream under the sun. The tenderness embedded in these acts carries through time. It is not lost. Next, we'll explore another layer of that tenderness, the rituals of the mouth, the hands, the body's smallest details. You'll meet Tomas of Toledo, whose wooden bristle brush sparked a new form of care. You'll discover how hygiene extended to the breath, the fingers, the heart, and through it all, you'll see how medieval people fought, not just for survival, but for grace. In the hushed stillness of early morning, before the city's chimneys, smoke, and market stalls stir, a ritual begins. A small wooden pick is drawn from a pouch. Fingers grip it with the familiarity of habit. It is lifted to the mouth, and with gentle precision, the spaces between teeth are cleared. Then comes the rinse salt water or wine, sometimes mint-infused. This is not modern dentistry. There are no drills, no sterile lights, no electric brushes. But in its simplicity, there is intention, care, and dignity. This is the world of dental and personal hygiene in the Middle Ages, a world not as foreign or as filthy as we've been led to believe. The truth, often overshadowed by myth, is that people in medieval Europe were deeply concerned with cleanliness only of the body, but also of the mouth, the nails, and the small, sacred details of personal care. Oral hygiene was considered essential not only for physical health, but for social grace. The breath, after all, spoke for the soul, and to allow one's mouth to sour was, in some circles, seen as a spiritual failing as well as a social offense. Tomas of Toledo understood this better than most. A quiet craftsman who worked with wood and bone, he had always been fascinated by the curve of the human hand and how tools could become extensions of care. When Queen Violante's chambermaid quietly inquired about a more elegant way for the queen to clean her teeth, Tomas set to work. He carved a slender handle from boxwood and embedded horsehair bristles into one end. He soaked the brush in vinegar and mint oil and presented it in a silken pouch embroidered with the queen's initials. It wasn't just accepted, it was treasured. Violante adored the freshness it brought, the way the bristles cleaned gently between her teeth. She shared it with her ladies-in-waiting, and soon Tomas was making brushes for nobles across Castile. Though his invention wouldn't carry his name into history, it planted a seed in early vision of the toothbrush as a personal relic of cleanliness and pride. But Tomas's work was just one branch of a much wider tree. Across Europe, oral care took many forms. Chewing sticks from aromatic trees like birch or hazel were common, often used after meals. People crushed mint, sage, and salt together to rub on their gums and teeth. Charcoal, oddly enough, was used to brighten smiles. Mouthwashes made from wine, vinegar, or herbal infusions were swished and spat in stone courtyards and wooden buckets alike. Toothpicks were found in almost every household, from carved silver implements in royal banquets to plain wooden slivers tucked behind a baker's ear. Manners books from the 13th and 14th centuries even instructed readers not to pick their teeth in public without covering their mouths. Clear evidence that the importance of oral hygiene was not only recognized but codified into etiquette. Children were taught these rituals early. A mother would press a bit of mint paste on a child's teeth, teaching the circular motion with patience and song. A father might show how to rinse with vinegar after bread and cheese, how to scrape the tongue gently with a curved sliver of bone. These practices were not reserved for the wealthy. Even those who lived in rural cottages without access to perfumed soap or silver bowls found ways to keep their mouths clean, using what grew nearby and what wisdom had been handed down. Personal hygiene extended far beyond the mouth. Hand washing was essential. In monasteries, lavatoriums were constructed long stone basins fed by fresh water where monks washed before prayer, meals, and sleep. Every church maintained a water basin at its entrance, not just for ritual purification, but for the practical washing of hands that had touched soil, parchment, or livestock. In homes, bowls and ewers stood at the door. A guest would be offered a towel and water as a sign of hospitality. It was common for households to own a washing set, a pitcher, a basin, and a drying cloth, often perfumed with herbs. Servants refreshed these regularly. It was considered ill-mannered to approach a shared meal with unwashed hands. Cleanliness, once again, was tied to respect not only for oneself, but for others. Grooming routines were woven into daily life. Fingernails were trimmed with small knives. Ears were cleaned with linen-wrapped twigs or metal scoops. Ointments were made to soften the soles of the feet after long walks. Powders were dusted onto skin to absorb sweat and odor. Scented oils were applied to the pulse points behind the ears, at the throat, on the wrists, not as luxury, but as offering. Even those who were ill or bedridden received attention. Caretakers washed their hands and faces with warm cloths, massaged them with oils, cleaned their nails, and combed their hair. Infirmaries, in abbeys and towns alike, kept records of hygiene as part of treatment. Clean bedding, fresh air, and bathing were seen as vital to healing. Though germ theory would come centuries later, instinct and observation had taught them that cleanliness supported recovery and preserved dignity. Religious orders formalized these insights. In the Rule of Saint Benedict, monks were instructed to bathe regularly and keep their bodies tidy, not out of vanity, but as a form of discipline, humility, and preparation. The body, though mortal, was sacred. Keeping it clean was an act of stewardship. The emotional impact of these rituals cannot be overstated. For someone like Thomas, to create a brush that soothed the Queen's breath was to participate in something larger than craft. It was to affirm that even the most intimate, private corners of human life, our nails, our skin, deserved attention and reverence. For children learning to rinse their mouths with salt water. For lovers who passed scented cloths between them. For the elderly whose aching joints were soothed with balm. Hygiene was love in motion. In times of grief, these acts became even more profound. After a death, women would often wash the body with herbs and oils, braid the hair, trim the nails. These final gestures, done in silence, were it not for the dead alone, they were for those left behind. They were partying rituals that said, you mattered. You were known and cared for until the very end. So while we may marvel at the invention of soap or the grandeur of bathhouses, let us not overlook the quieter, more intimate rituals that defined medieval personal hygiene. They were not loud, nor were they always documented in manuscripts or paintings, but they lived in hands that combed hair, in fingertips that traced toothpicks along molars, in water basins filled each morning with fresh intentions. These people, so often misrepresented as crude or careless, were instead meticulous in their own way, guided by tradition, limited by their tools but not by their imagination. They found grace in the brush of bristles, in the splash of cool water, in the mingled scent of mint and myrrh. Their hygiene was not ours, but it was theirs, and in it, they found order, health, and peace. Next, we step into the shadow of crisis and discovery. You'll see how cleanliness became not just a personal virtue, but a public necessity during the darkest of times. Plague, fear, and innovation collided, and, from that chaos, emerged new ideas about health and sanitation. And at the center of that story stands Lady Celestina of Ghent, whose generosity helped rewrite the rules of survival. Stay with me. The stench came first, then the silence, then the bells. In the summer of 1348, when the Black Death swept through Europe like a storm no prayer could stop, it was not only the sick who trembled, but the well. Families sealed their doors, priests whispered blessings through cloth, and in towns from Florence to Ghent, the very idea of public health was born, not from science, but from desperation. Until that moment, hygiene had been a personal virtuous act of care, of faith, of daily dignity. But now, it became something more urgent, more communal. Cleanliness was no longer only about comfort or ritual. It became a weapon, a defense, a fragile line between life and death. And those who had once viewed bathhouses as indulgences began to see them as sanctuaries, places that might, just might, keep the plague at bay. Lady Celestina of Ghent understood this before many. The daughter of a wealthy merchant and widow to a physician lost early in the outbreak, she had watched her world unravel with clinical clarity. Servants died, neighbors vanished, and still the city echoed with denial. But Celestina did not retreat. Instead, she listened. She listened to the old woman who swore by vinegar foot baths, to the friar who insisted on boiling linens, to the midwife who washed her hands with ash and rosewater after every birth. And then, she acted, using her fortune and the empty storehouses left by her late husband. Celestina began converting a crumbling granary near the river into what would become one of Europe's earliest plague bathhouses, not a place of beauty, but of prevention. She hired workers to scrub the floors with lime, to boil vats of herbal water, to build a drainage system that channeled used water far from the building. She brought in soapmakers, including apprentices of Edric from Florence, who produced harsh but effective blocks of pine tar soap. And she opened her doors, not to nobles, but to the poor, the weavers, the beggars, the widows, the children. In those stone rooms, steam rose not with luxury, but with hope. Each bath, each rinsed cloth, each mended robe became a defiant prayer against disease. For many, it was their first time bathing in months. For some, it was their last. But all were met with the same tenderness. No one asked for coin, no one was turned away. And outside, others began to notice. The city council of Ghent, at first skeptical, could not ignore the reports. Those who bathed at Celestina's house survived at higher rates. The outbreak, though still terrible, seemed to slow in that part of the city. By winter's end, laws began to change. Ordinances were passed, requiring the cleaning of public streets. Vendors were fined for throwing waste into alleys. Inns were told to provide hand-washing stations, and other cities followed suit. In Lübeck, municipal workers began scrubbing wells and closing markets during outbreaks. In Siena, bathhouse hours were extended and entry fees waived. In Marseille, soap production was regulated by a new guild that monitored quality and cleanliness. Hygiene, once a matter of personal pride or spiritual purity, was becoming a civic responsibility. Of course, they didn't understand germs. They couldn't name bacteria or viruses, but they saw patterns. They noticed that cleaner quarters fared better, that those who washed, aired out clothes, and burned old bedding survived more often than those who didn't. And so, they built, from instinct, a kind of proto-sanitation system, one made not of pipes and codes, but of practice and memory. These weren't sweeping reforms. Many places resisted. Some blamed bathhouses themselves for spreading disease, misunderstanding the crowded conditions and the mix of sick and healthy. In places like London, bathhouses were shut down altogether during certain outbreaks, but others, like Venice, pioneered quarantine stations, lazarettos where ships and travelers were held outside city walls, washed, inspected, and isolated if needed. The language of hygiene was changing, and it was being written in the harsh ink of necessity. For those who lived through it, the emotional toll was staggering. Grief clung to every surface. The smell of death became familiar, and yet, in the middle of it all, people still reached for clean water, for soap, for rituals that made them feel human again. Celestina herself was said to walk the corridors of her bathhouse each night with a lantern, stopping to speak softly to the sick, to squeeze their hands, to whisper blessings as warm cloths were pressed to foreheads. Her bathhouse eventually became a model. Pilgrims passed through and brought stories home. Cities wrote new bylaws, and in time, the idea that public health and cleanliness were linked, though it would take centuries to prove, began to sink into Europe's bones. But beyond laws and ordinances, there was something deeper happening. Cleanliness was becoming emotional resilience. In a world where so little could be controlled, to wash one's face, to change into a clean tunic, to walk streets scrubbed by neighbors, became acts of radical hope. It was a way of saying, I am still here, I still matter. We still matter. The story of sanitation in the Middle Ages is not one of perfection. It is one of progress, born of pain, of improvisation born of grief. And it is one that, in its own way, laid the groundwork for what we now call public health as we move forward. Remember Celestina not as a noblewoman draped in velvet, but as a figure walking barefoot across cold stone, carrying a basin of clean water to a stranger who had lost everything. Her hands, scented with soap and rosemary, touched the future. And in that touch, she reminded the world that healing does not always begin in hospitals. Sometimes, it begins in warm water, in silence, in care. In our final part, we will look not at sickness, but at beauty. We will reflect on how hygiene, from the grandest bath to the smallest comb, shaped the medieval concept of worth, status, and even love. You'll hear the voice of Edith from York, writing to her daughter, Honora, sharing the wisdom of water, lavender, and womanhood. Join me for the final chapter. When we think of the Middle Ages, the mind often conjures dim, grimy images, people cloaked in rags, the stench of unwashed bodies drifting through cramped alleyways, a world thick with disease and ignorance. But what if that image was never real? What if the truth, long buried beneath centuries of misconception and the dust of disdainful historians, revealed something far more human, tender, and familiar? Across every bathhouse stone, every rose-scented salve, and every basin of river water, there is evidence not just of cleanliness, but of care. The Middle Ages were not void of beauty. They shimmered with rituals born of love, tradition, and a quiet but persistent understanding that the body is sacred, that the self deserves tending. In this final step of our journey, we must reimagine the past, not as a dark void, but as a world richly textured with light, shadow, and the gleam of water reflecting candlelight. Lady Maerwynn of Bruges knew this. Every Thursday, she bathed not because society required it, but because it was the 1 hour in her week when she could be still. As the scent of lavender rose from the tub, she remembered her mother's hands pouring warm water, her sister brushing her hair by firelight. These moments, private and powerful, connected her to lineage, to femininity, to self. It wasn't about vanity. It was about presence. Aldrich in Florence knew this. When he mixed his soap, he thought not of profit, but of skin, how to soothe it, protect it, perfume it just enough that someone might close their eyes and feel peace. His bars were soft gold and forest green, and when he cut them, he imagined how they would rest in a merchant's hands, in a child's drawer, on the edge of a widow's bath. His craft was a language of comfort, each batch a message of care. Friar Edric, the monk of Canterbury, knew it too. His soaps, infused with herbs from monastery gardens, were gifts of healing. For the sick, they were acts of mercy. For the healthy, they were shields. His work straddled science and spirit, where the cleansing of the body became an expression of faith. Every lather was a liturgy, every rinse a prayer, and Isolde of Lyon, laundress and visionary, knew it most intimately. She understood that the washing of fabric was never just about dirt. It was about restoring dignity. Her dream of a bathhouse for women, a place filled with warmth, laughter, and sisterhood, wasn't born from luxury, but necessity. She believed that every woman deserved to feel clean, to feel seen. Her towels carried the scent of mint and resilience. Her hands, hardened by years of scrubbing, never forgot the softness of tending others. Thomas of Toledo, humble craftsman, carved a toothbrush for a queen not because he sought glory, but because he understood the intimacy of breath, the pride of a clean mouth, the way a single tool could make someone feel worthy. His invention was never named in books, but it lived on in bristles, in mint oil, in morning rituals passed quietly from hand to hand. And Lady Celestina of Ghent, whose bathhouse became a beacon during the darkest days. She understood that water could hold more than dirt. It could hold hope. She watched people come to her doors hollowed by grief, and leave with skin glowing from steam and faces softened by kindness. She didn't see herself as a savior. She saw herself as a servant of something sacred, the right of every soul to be touched with tenderness. These are not just characters from history. They are fragments of ourselves, our longing for rest, for care, for something as simple and profound as feeling clean. Through them, we see that hygiene in the Middle Ages was never primitive. It was purposeful. It was layered with emotion, ritual, and meaning. It was, in its own quiet way, revolutionary. The misconception of a filthy, uncaring medieval world was never based on fact. It was born of later centuries' arrogance, of industrial era attempts to contrast their progress with imagined barbarism. But history tells a different story. Manuscripts and archaeological digs, poems and personal letters, they speak of scented baths, polished combs, healing salves, and clean linens warmed by sun. So why does it matter? Why should we care how people washed 700 years ago? Because in a world where we still struggle to balance survival with self-care, where rituals of cleanliness are sometimes framed as indulgent rather than necessary, their story reminds us that tending the body has always been an act of rebellion against despair. Because when we bathe, brush, scrub, or soften, we're participating in a legacy older than we know, a human need, not just for cleanliness, but for dignity, restoration, and connection. In the final pages of this story, we find a letter, fragment of parchment from York, written by Edith to her daughter, Honora, who had just married and moved to a distant town. My dearest Honora, keep rosemary in your linens and lavender in your bath. Do not neglect your hair, it is your crown. In your memory, let the water that touches your skin carry more than dust. Let it carry away worry. Breathe in deeply when you wash, and remember me. Remember that you come from a line of women who found strength in soap and silence, in warmth and water. Your loving mother, Edith. This letter, fictional yet deeply rooted in truth, is not just advice. It's a map, a reminder that water holds stories, that when we care for our bodies, we tend to something timeless. The past isn't a place of filth and darkness. It is a place of humanity, complex, vibrant, and endlessly worthy of rediscovery. So let us reimagine the Middle Ages not as a world lost in dirt, but as a world that gleamed quietly, defiantly with candlelight on water, with hands that cleaned and healed, with people who knew, even then, that to care for the body is to honor the soul. And may we carry that wisdom forward, with every drop of water, every brushstroke, every ritual that reminds us we are worth the care. We always have been. Across the 7 chapters of our journey into the hidden world of medieval hygiene, we've uncovered not just facts, but lives real, textured, and deeply human lives. We didn't merely learn that people in the Middle Ages bathed more than we thought. We witnessed the intimate, emotional, and social rituals of caring for the body in a world far more nuanced than the myths we've inherited. Let us now return to the characters who guided us, each a thread in the rich tapestry of this forgotten history, and gather the essence of their stories, their decisions, their beliefs, and the legacy they left behind. Lady Maerwynn of Bruges was a woman ahead of her time, not in invention, but in reverence. In her chamber, filled with herbs and rosewater, she did what many noblewomen did. She bathed weekly, she perfumed her skin, and she treated bathing not as a chore, but as a form of presence. Yet, what set her apart was her ability to find peace and clarity in the ritual. She was not escaping her role as a noble or her responsibilities in court. Rather, she was anchoring herself. With every drop of lavender oil, she connected to memory, womanhood, and a deeper understanding of care as power. Through Maerwynn, we saw that self-care is not selfish, shit is the soil from which strength grows. Edric, the soapmaker's apprentice in Florence, began his story in the shadows hauling firewood, washing down bathhouse floors, but emerged as a craftsman whose product was not only coveted, but trusted. His obsession with creating better, softer, safer soap was not born of ambition alone. It came from his deep sense of empathy. He watched old men wince as soap burned their cracked hands. He heard women talk of their children's rashes. He listened, he learned, and he crafted something better. His soap became a tool for comfort, a vehicle of healing. Edric reminded us that mastery is not just about skill, but compassion applied with precision. Then came Friar Edric of Canterbury, the monk who believed that soap could be both sacred and medicinal. He worked not for profit or praise, but from duty to God, to his brothers in the abbey, to the sick who came for aid. Edric infused his soap with herbs, not to smell pleasant, but to serve a purpose. His work was ministry in the form of lather. In him, we saw the intersection of spirituality and science, ritual and reason. Edric's story teaches us that faith, when coupled with action, becomes tangible, whether through a sermon or a simple bar of soap. Isolde of Lyon, the laundress with a dream, carried the weight of other people's lives in the baskets of soiled garments she cleaned. But she also carried a hope that one day, women like her wouldn't just scrub away dirt, but would find spaces to renew their spirits. Her bathhouse for women began with nothing but an idea and the rhythm of her hands at work. It became a sanctuary, a place where bodies were not judged, where laughter echoed with steam, and where the sacredness of female connection was celebrated in soap and silence. Isolde shows us that dreaming from the margins does not make your dream small, it makes your achievement profound. Thomas of Toledo, the quiet woodcarver who crafted the first known toothbrush for Queen Violante, never saw himself as a revolutionary. He simply answered a question: can this be done better? His brush, soaked in mint and vinegar, became a personal ritual of the Queen, and eventually of many others. But Thomas's real legacy was his insight into the quiet needs that others overlooked. Through his hands, a tool of dignity was born. Thomas reminds us that small innovations, rooted in care, can ripple outward and change how we live. Lady Celestina of Ghent, perhaps the most striking figure of all, turned personal grief into public grace. With a heart broken by plague, she didn't retreat behind stone walls. She built, She transformed an abandoned granary into a bathhouse for the poor. She created a haven in a time of horror, one bucket of warm water at a time, and in doing so, she helped her city survive not just the sickness, but the despair that came with it. She turned hygiene into a humanitarian act. Her life tells us that leadership is not about speeches or crowns, it's about compassion in motion. Finally, Edith of York, though not as prominent in public life, left behind something equally enduring: a letter. A simple note to her daughter Honora, filled with wisdom passed through generations. Keep rosemary in your linens. Remember that cleanliness is not just about appearance, it is about spirit. Her words distilled everything we have come to understand through these stories. That care is legacy. That rituals outlive rulers. That water carries memory. So what can we take from all of this? First, we must destroy the myth that the past was stupid, dirty, and backward. It wasn't. It was different. It was bound by the materials available, the knowledge of the time, the shape of the world. But people in the Middle Ages were thoughtful, inventive, and emotionally intelligent. They created systems of hygiene, health, and grooming that were meaningful, ritualized, and deeply tied to their values. They knew what we sometimes forget, that to care for the body is to care for the mind, the heart, the community. Second, we can learn to slow down. Modern life moves at a frantic pace. Hygiene has become another rushed task: a quick shower, a hasty brush, a product marketed to fix rather than nourish. The people of the Middle Ages, constrained by their time, approached these moments with reverence. Bathing was a ritual. Hair brushing was an act of intimacy. Tooth care was a morning devotion. We can reclaim that mindset. We can turn grooming from a chore into a practice, one that grounds us, centers us, and reminds us that we are alive. We are worthy. We are whole. Third, we must expand our definition of care. It is not limited to the rich, or the young, or the healthy. Every character we met made care accessible. They bathed the poor. They crafted tools for queens and farmers alike. They washed the dead, cleaned the sick, served the grieving. In our own lives, care must move outward. Our families, our neighbors, our communities. A warm meal, a clean shirt, a hand on the shoulder. These are acts of hygiene to soul hygiene. Finally, we must remember that history is not only found in battles or treaties. It is found in wash basins, in herbs laid on linen, in soap scraped from wooden molds. It is found in gestures passed down quietly, in things that made people feel safe, comforted, and clean. And those are the things worth preserving. So the next time you pour a bath, rub oil into your skin, or brush your teeth before sleep, remember them. Remember Lady Maerwynn's.com, Aldrich's care, Edric's conviction, Isolde's strength, Tomas's precision, Celestina's courage, and Edith's gentle love. Let their stories guide your hands. Let them remind you that even in the darkest times, people reached for water, for warmth, for one another. And so can we. Because in the end, history isn't just what happened, it's what we carry forward. And maybe, just maybe, in learning how medieval people found meaning in soap and steam, we can learn how to find meaning in our own daily rituals, how to turn ordinary moments into sacred ones, and how to live not just clean lives, but lives filled with intention, memory, and grace.